Plaza within seconds before the shooting, a photograph of Rip Robertson and Grayson Lynch. And that's important because Rip Robertson happens to be the fellow, let me tell you who Rip Robertson is and why it's so important that he's standing right there in Dealey Plaza, and you can see the picture of the president in Connolly's vehicle going right past him, and you can see him tipping his hat like this just before the shots rang out. It turns out that the reason we know who he is because back in June, I want to take you together now back to June of 1963. This is now just a matter of a few months before the president was killed in Dallas in November of 1963. It turns out that Richard Billings was, at that time, the Miami bureau chief for Time Life magazine. And he received a call and was told to go to the Miami National Airport. This is the night of June 8th of 1963. He went to the Miami International Airport at midnight, was met by a group of men there and taken to what they call Corrosion Corner, which is this big corner where the covert flights come out of Miami. And he was put on an airplane, one of those seaplanes, and flown with 10 men out onto the ocean. They landed on the ocean, and they disembarked and got onto a yacht, a large yacht. It was called the Flying Tiger, too. It was owned by a man by the name of William Pauley. William Pauley turns out to be a very close friend of C.D. Jackson, who was, in fact, the editor-in-chief of Time Life magazine. And that's why Billings was asked to go, because C.D. Jackson, the editor-in-chief of Time Life, wanted to have him on board this yacht because they were taking an assassination team ashore that was going to make an attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro. And it turns out that the person who was in charge of that assassination team on that date from June 8th to June 10th was in fact Rip Robertson. And when they'd put this team of assassins over the side in this rubber dinghy with a little silent motor on it to go ashore in Cuba, on the night of June 10th, they were on board, and Dick Billings was standing there with William Pauley and a man by the name of John Marino, and they were griping about John Kennedy and Bob Kennedy having ordered them to stand down from trying to assassinate Castro. Because as soon as Bobby and John found out early in June that there was an assassination team that was put together to kill Castro, they gave the order to stand them down. And we know about this particular evening, what occurred, because when John Moreno was griping about the Kennedys and what SOBs they were and how rotten they were for trying to stop them from killing Castro, William Pauley turned directly to him that night on June 10th of 1963 in the presence of Dick Billings and the others and said, "Don't you worry, John, we're going to kill that motherfucker." And these are the people who know exactly how to do that stuff. This was the major assassination team that was put together to kill Castro. And so what I want to do briefly is I want to tell you, unfold to you in detail how this whole thing happened so you can understand what it is that happened to the president, then what happened to Bobby, so you can understand what did happen and what didn't happen. And so you can see what the real contours of a conspiracy are like and what they're not like, so that we can then use that as a template to evaluate what's going on here in the UFO field. What happened in this instance is we have to go back to 1960 to understand this. That, as you recall, in June of 1960, Richard Nixon, who had been the Vice President of the United States for 8 years under the Eisenhower-Nixon administration, from 1952 to 1960, Richard Nixon, in June of 1960, is nominated by the Republican National Convention to be the presidential nominee for the Republican Party. What he does is he contacts, immediately within 2 days, he contacts Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes, that before he'd become basically a vegetable with 9-inch fingernails and all that. That he had been, as many of you know, he had been a major inventor, a very creative guy. He invented the Spruce Goose, which became the prototype for the C-5A cargo plane. And he had developed contempt for everybody in the Hollywood community and had just basically withdrawn, and people didn't see him much anymore. Well, what happened is Howard Hughes actually became a major consultant to the National Security Agency that had been created by the National Security Act of 1947. Howard Hughes had a thing called the Summa Corporation, and he invented major technological things for the National Security Agency, one of which was the Glomar Explorer that was able to pick up submarines off the bottom of the ocean in the C-5A cargo plane, etc. And in that capacity, he had become a friend, an associate at least, of Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon, in his capacity as the vice president under Eisenhower for 8 years, chaired the 5412 Committee. The 5412 Committee is a special subcommittee of the National Security Council, which is in charge of covert operations. And so Richard Nixon, for 8 years, chaired the Covert Operations Subcommittee of the National Security Council from 1952 to 1960. And in that capacity, he became familiar with Howard Hughes. So immediately upon Richard Nixon winning the Republican nomination for the presidency in June of 1960, Richard Nixon contacted Howard Hughes by secret telephone contact that they have, a scrambled phone, and told Howard Hughes that Richard Nixon wanted Hughes to organize a political assassination team to assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and 5 other men who had, as of January of 1959, overthrown the Batista regime down in Cuba and had established a revolutionary government. And Richard Nixon wanted them assassinated. So he contacted Hughes and asked Hughes to do this and to keep it away from the office of the presidency. Don't let it track back here. You get that done. And Howard Hughes agreed to do that in June of 1960. Howard Hughes contacted one of his lawyers, at that time a comparatively young one of his lawyers, a man by the name of Robert Mayhew, and assigned Mayhew the responsibility of getting this done. Robert Mayhew, in turn, contacted a man by the name of Johnny Roselli in Las Vegas. You remember Howard Hughes owned, this, I think, the Sands Hotel, or at that time, one of them, and was there. And so Johnny Roselli was the representative in Las Vegas for Sam Giancana, the Don of the Mafia in Chicago, who, as you know, are deeply involved in the casinos in Las Vegas. And so Howard Hughes's lawyer, Bob Mayhew, contacts Johnny Roselli and says, the president, they started referring to Nixon as the president already, because they said, well, there's this young pipsqueak kid from Massachusetts that's been nominated by the Democratic Party, this John Kennedy, you know, whose old man has kind of bought him the nomination. And so everybody thought that Nixon was going to win. So Bob Mayhew said to Johnny Roselli, you know, the president wants this assassination team put together, and you guys